Technology is cyclical, and over the last 60 years, one of the big cycles we've seen is the conversion from centralized computing with mainframes into distributed computing on desktops and back into centralized computing with cloud. And so most consumers and most people think about cloud as really this movement back into centralization. But as it relates to IT systems and desktops and the actual end user experience of what they interact with on a day-to-day basis, terminal services, now what we would call DAS, VDI, virtual desktop, these sorts of things have been around 20 plus years. And had the pleasure of talking with Gary Coben, Kevin Sullivan with Evolve IP about their DAS platform and how they're enabling and helping businesses. We talk about the 4 pillars. I actually think there's a 5th pillar of things that they actually really enable with their DAS platform. And really how DAS is a tool to solve business problems and how many business problems really can be addressed and solved with DAS that aren't actually even really considered a lot of times. It's a very fun conversation for me. I hope you get something out of it as well, Gary. But, other than that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Oh, goodness. Yeah. It's, nowadays, if you're not used to just talking blankly into your computer screen, it's just, do people actually exist anymore? I'm not really sure. So we're in that world.
We'll start it that way, huh? So my name is Gary Coben. I'm the Senior Vice President of the channel here at Evolve IP. 2023 marks year number 15 for me at the helm of the channel at Evolve IP, and so always excited to talk to my good friend Max Clark.
Yeah, Max, Kevin Sullivan. I am the Director of Solutions Engineering here at Evolve IP, specifically focused on our compute practice. And may not have the tenure of Gary, but I am working on year number 7 here at Evolve and have been in the cloud space since around 2012 or so. So have definitely been around the block a few times, but not as many as Gary. Well,
he's a lot smarter than me, so it took me twice as long just to get to where
I want to actually segue on this for a second because the other day I was in a conversation, and the average tenure now for senior executives at a company is right around 2 years. CISOs, I think, is 18 months. CIOs is 20 to 24 months-ish. As when you look at stats, that's the average tenure. And 15 years and 7 years is, I wouldn't really equate it to tribal knowledge, but when you talk about longevity of experience and roles and leadership and just that arc of watching the business evolve over that period of time, that says a lot. I mean, that's a pretty, I don't know how you leverage that or talk about that more, but a lot of what I've started talking about with companies is, if you're expecting your staff to turn over every 2 years, how are you onboarding and training and bringing people up to speed? And is an MSP a good place for you to be looking at anyways? Because that MSP is going to give you that, that continuity, of operations that maybe you can't get yourself anymore.
So, I'll throw a comment in there because oddly enough, I have a 31-year-old daughter that also works for Evolve IP. She runs our account management group. So the interesting thing, of course, is when we get into the technology, when you reach my age, 60 plus, my expectation is that if my PC breaks, I expect my company to buy it. Her expectation was, I'm not using it anyway. I'm using my MacBook. I just want access to your desktop. Now, when it comes to longevity, what I remind her of, and I would remind all young people, is that the guys and gals making the decisions to hire people are in my generation. And we value tenure, and we value seniority, and we value time. We don't value people that have, 5 different jobs in 10 different years.
So, Evolve IP, this is not a new business. Obviously, it's been around for a while. Let's put it this way: how did Evolve IP start? What was it? What was the problem or the focus at inception? What did it see in the market? What was the we're going to go out and tackle this problem? And then fast forward me to like present day, what is the service, you could say either verticals or segments that you're focused on.
So I would say that one of the themes about Evolve IP that has always been common back when I started in 2008 to the present is we wanted to be more than a single threaded provider. When I think back to 2008, it was a completely different market. We were, one of the original BroadSoft shops for UCaaS in its infancy. We had a contact center play. We had hosted applications in terms of things like Exchange, and we had a security practice too that was based on things like antivirus and hosted firewall. We knew that thematically, if companies bought one solution, they were more apt to continue to buy additional solutions. And that has, truly been the cornerstone of what we've tried to do over the years. Now, as Kevin will tell you, when he joined the company was in the beginning of virtual desktop. We were, as far as I can tell, we had to be one of the very first people that were out in the marketplace talking about hosted VDI. And so when I look at what the company does today, we're focused in, primarily 4 core areas, right? We know what's happened in the UCaaS market. So we are, from a voice perspective, focused entirely on Microsoft Teams Enterprise Voice and Cisco WebEx Enterprise Voice. But I think a big focus for us these days is in hosted desktops for a lot of reasons. One of them being you can't get PCs in bulk now, even if you wanted to. So, the continuation of geopolitical forces and global chip shortages, and the ability for IT professionals to do more with less, we think is driving the market for virtual desktop. As contact centers begin to move their people remote, right? There's, when they're working in their living room, they no longer have access to an on-site supervisor, hence the continued proliferation of collaboration platforms like a Teams, like a Zoom, like a WebEx. More importantly, though, the last person you want to buy a $2,000 PC for is for an employee whose average tenure is less than 6 months. So we are really starting to see that be a big lift for us. So still in the contact center space, but we have our own intellectual property for contact center. And I would say that's pretty much fundamentally for customers that are heavily embedded in Microsoft Teams or Cisco WebEx. But we also have the ability, which I'm sure Kevin will share later on, is we have the ability to stand up any UCaaS or contact center platform inside of our desktop because of, again, when you liken what VMware and Citrix has done relative to enabling real-time audio video, our ability to run a 5.9 client or run Zoom or run an Avaya client inside of our desktop is really driving things from a virtual desktop perspective for us. So I think, again, just to summarize, when you think about where we started and where we are today, it's still very much the same thing. We wanted to be a multifaceted supplier that offered multiple solutions for the primary reason of driving more revenue and retaining customers for a longer period of time.
I'm going to share something here really quickly, which I want to talk about here. So this is your website. This is your homepage. you have some really small logos listed on your landing page, and this is what I've find with a lot, and Evolve I'd put into this category, right? Like, if I walk down the street and I said to somebody, hey, do you know Evolve IP? Probably not going to say yes, right? It's a very, you have a very specific niche in terms of the market and who you're going after. But let's see here. Madison Square Garden, Nike, Ford, Marriott, Chick-fil-A, Apria. I'm sure everybody has heard of at least 4 of those companies, if not all of them. And what you're talking about, terminology, and I hate the marketing mumbo jumbo that technology gets into. So like UCAS and CCAS and this, that, and that CAS. But, when you talk about hosted desktop and you talk about a UCAS, you're talking about really the core computing collaboration and, and base like foundational for work for a company, right? A company needs, if they have people interacting with a computer, they need computers, they need desktops, they need to communicate with each other, they need to communicate internally, they need to communicate externally. Not every company would say they run a contact center, but almost every company runs some sort of interaction with either clients or vendors calling them, customers or vendors calling them. And really, that's contact center functionality for most people. Like, do you need to record your phone calls? That's a contact center. Do you need to do agent training? That's a contact center. So, but anyways, the virtual desktop thing is always kind of interesting to me, and I want to dig into this because you guys see this as a service provider. So obviously, your customers come to you in part because they're interested in virtual desktop, and so we have, VDI, we have DAS, we have hosted desktop. There's all these different terminologies that come into, what is what versus the other thing. But this isn't like, at this point, I remember seeing my first Microsoft-based virtualized desktop, I think in 1998, which of course, and this was on Microsoft NT4, Terminal Services 1. And that concept of having resources centralized and then a screen display remote goes way back to the birth of everything with the original mainframes, the original, microcomputers, and the birth of the internet in the 60s. You're it's like this is the new thing, right, for companies to be looking at that's really like 60 plus years old, right? So and I want to hear actually your take on this, because when I start talking about this with somebody that doesn't have experience with it, they'll say something to me like, well, what does it look like? And I'm like, well, what do you mean, what does it look like? What happens when you turn your computer on? That's what it looks like. It's just your computer's not on your computer anymore. It's like over here in this other place instead. So walk me through that conversation of somebody who I think there's, Gary, you touched on a business problem, right? Like, how do we get equipment to an employee? How do we buy the equipment, source the equipment, deliver the equipment, manage the equipment? What do we do if the employee turns over, right? There's more problem statements in that I want to dig into, but somebody that's going out to solve this problem, let's talk about that interaction of like, what's the journey look like for them?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you don't mind, Max, you touched on a couple interesting things there, right? So first and foremost, I agree with you, right? We live in a cyclical industry, and I feel like IT in general has been a constant pendulum swing from distributed to consolidated computing, right? We constantly go back and forth, right? Mainframe virtualization, distributed computing, edge computing. We're constantly making that variation. So on that point, right, remote desktop capabilities have been around. The protocols that we leverage to connect to them are almost as old as I am, right? It has been around since the 90s. And interestingly enough, that technology, for the most part, hadn't really fundamentally changed throughout that time. So a lot of the same ways that folks were envisioning connecting to those desktop resources back in that early 2000s era was still the way things were done a year or two ago. And in some organizations, still the way things are done today. The big thing that has been a game changer for the industry is now the ability to do optimized real-time audio and video in a desktop, right? And just like yourself, I'm not a huge fan of terminology and buzzwords because I feel like we tend to set ourselves up for failure a lot with that, because a lot of times, like, you say a word like optimization, right? And it means different things to different people depending on who it is that's receiving the message. So really what we're talking about now is, historically, you think about VDI, you think about desktop as a service, you think about remote desktop services, terminal services. Those things always had one thing in common. They always fell down with anything that was a media-rich user experience, right? Mm-hmm. Audio, video. It just weren't flat out good enough to handle that from a user experience side as far as performance went. Mostly, that was a combination of two things, right? The protocol that you use to deliver the desktop, right? So again, we're still using RDP, which has been around since the 90s. And the fact that virtual machines that we're connecting to in our modern iterations of desktop and VDI just aren't good at doing that work, right? Like a virtual processor is just not good at doing audio and video. So, how do we address that? Well, that technology hasn't changed. Those virtual processors still aren't good at doing that. But what has changed is now the data delivery solutions are now intelligent enough to make use of a client's local resources, right? We don't want to get too far into the weeds on this from a technical perspective, but what that ultimately means for us is now true mobility and portability. Right now, in that virtual desktop, no matter where you're connecting to it from, you can do all of the things that you need to do in order to function as an employee. So your voice calls, your video calls, you name it. And you hit on another great point, right? I think the challenge in selling this and talking about this and going into the market with this is it's underwhelming by design. A desktop is a desktop is a desktop, right? We don't want it to be complicated because we understand users have all different levels of technical aptitude. So it then becomes more, what are the business challenges that a desktop solution, if it's well-formed and well-articulated, allow us to solve? And I'm a huge fan of like making things overly simplistic and mnemonic devices and things like that. So, the way I approach it is DAS is simple, right? And simple kind of tying back to security, mobility, performance, and logistics. Those are the four main key areas from a business challenge perspective that a well-formed DAS or desktop solution can help an organization solve for.
May I add something to that? Because what I think is very interesting is that there has been a fundamental shift between the conversations that were going on in boardrooms in 2022 to the conversations that are going on in boardrooms today. And here's what I mean by that. Last year, we were talking about, okay, the pandemic is over, but remote work is here to stay. How do I make my user's experience that works from home the same as my user's experience that works from the office? Now, all of a sudden, we've come into 2023. There isn't a news feed that I don't get on a daily basis that announces a new slew of layoffs impacting all companies, all sectors, all geographies. So all of a sudden now, the thing that's on your customer's mind is, I have to do more with less. I'm going to have, I'm not concerned about controlling my budget. I'm concerned about the fact that my budget will be cut. I'm concerned with the fact that my headcount will be reduced. I'm concerned over the fact that I've got significant constraints going on within IT. The thing about the whole concept of the PC process, I got to procure it, I got to provision it, I got to secure it, I've got to manage and support it, I've got to refresh it, and now the one that's concerning everybody, I got to go reclaim that asset. So all of a sudden, in 2023, we are looking at a very, very different marketplace. And we believe that that marketplace will drive the largest adoption of desktop as a service for two reasons. The first being that the business is going to demand it. And the second being is that the user experience per Kevin is as good, if not better, than it would be by going to Best Buy and buying a brand new PC?
There's a lot to unpack, right? So going back to Kevin's 4 things, right? So 2 of the things that you touched on, security, mobility, or actually 3 things: security, mobility, logistics. What was your 4th?
Performance or productivity.
Okay, performance. So like real world horror stories I've experienced personally. Somebody has information in an Excel spreadsheet that they probably shouldn't have in an Excel spreadsheet saved to their desktop, and leaves that laptop in their car, and their car is broken into, and all of a sudden that laptop walks off into who knows where. And then you find out that that laptop contains a spreadsheet detailing the personal information, salary, social security numbers, home addresses, and maybe bank account information for every single person in the company. And then you turn into oh my goodness, let's just pray that they don't turn this laptop on and poke around in here, and that they're just trying to harvest it for parts, and what do we do about it? So that was, I've experienced this more than once. I haven't been the one losing a laptop, but I've experienced this phone call. Logistics, I mean, the last 2 years, it's been there's how do we ship equipment to people at their houses and get them working and connected to our network, which then exposes a similar experience, which is how do we, what's the push? It's how do we ensure that we don't have corporate owned data on personal devices? That's usually the request that comes across. It's like the coded for, I have a mandate from my supply chain, from my customers. In order to do business with them, I need to ensure that their data doesn't end up on a non-corporate owned endpoint. And how do we ensure that, right? Or, how do we onboard a person in a location where they can't drive to our office? My personal favorite. Hey, we're augmenting with a team in pick a country: Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Indonesia, somewhere in Europe. I mean, like basically put a pin on the map somewhere and say, okay, we are now going to spin up 100, 200, 300 employees in this market, and that ends up being an interesting thought exercise where you're like, okay, well, we're going to now ship equipment into that market, so we need to ship. Let's just say as a company profile or a risk profile, you say it's totally okay for us to ship $2,000 worth of equipment to somebody in Colombia or in Brazil or Indonesia or whatever, right? Because, you say reclaiming these assets, you do that knowing you're never going to see that box again, right? But it's okay for you. It just fits into your profile. And I've seen people do this, and then they discover this horrible thing called customs. And let's just say that they found a place to ship the equipment, then they ship the equipment, and then this equipment goes on customs hold for importation taxes and who knows what else reasons, just because it got lost in a loading dock. And it's sitting on a loading dock for 3 to 6 weeks where you can't touch it. Now you've got people you can't onboard, right? So I don't think a lot of people really connect there's another way of doing this. So I want to, really, like I said, I want to unpack this in terms of, real world, what kind of problems or, because when I hear it, like, okay, we're going to ship equipment to, some market, right? Or how do we ensure it's on, like traditional, MDM or UEM solutions come up, mobile device management or your unified endpoint management come up. Like, oh, okay, we can secure this device by saying you can't, we're going to create a profile in the UEM that says you can't copy data onto your USB drive. But it's, like it shifts a lot when you start talking about what does this mean for DAS. So I don't know who wants to bite into this over there, if Gary or Kevin.
Yeah, I'm always happy to
start.
Yeah, always happy to take a first pass here, Max. And Gary's always good at the color commentary over the top. So certainly open to Gary interject at any point if you think it's helpful. But so those are all great points. And there's a whole other side of this too that we didn't even touch in that, which is, let's assume for a moment that none of the things that you just expressed are concerns actually go sideways on us, which is a heck of an assumption because odds are at least one, if not several of them are going to. But now there's a compliance problem sprinkled into this as well, right? So depending on the location where we're sending that equipment or where those users are working, What if there's a GDPR requirement that, they're required by their government to work exclusively on data that's in the location from which they're connecting? So, just a whole other complexion that gets added into the myriad of potential issues with distribution of equipment out to remote users in other locations, especially internationally. So all of that said, right, the foremost part of this is, how do we extend out to remote users, wherever they may be, this idea that, hey, I have these four logical walls that I've built of my data center, right? And historically, all of my servers, all of my data, all of my stuff is there. But when people need to work on that stuff, we're breaking containment, right? We're taking things out of that protected environment to do whatever we're going to do to it, and then we put it back when we're done. So the argument that we make, or any DaaS provider makes, is, hey, why not take where your people are doing their work on that stuff and put it directly next to where that stuff is, right? So now those four logical walls, from a security perspective, from a compliance perspective, apply not only to your data, not only to your servers, but where your people are working as well, because now they're just connecting across the internet into that environment to do whatever it is that they need to do as part of doing their job. In addition to that, right, just by virtue of having those things in that four wall structure, we now make manageability of the environment easier too, right? Because now we don't have to worry, if you're an IT admin, I'm an IT admin. It's hard enough managing all of the devices, the desktops, the laptops that are in our office and our branch locations. The last 2 years have now, exponentially increased the challenges of dealing with these devices that are everywhere, right? So if we can control where those devices are and have a single management pane into them, one single location where we can do things, I mean, human nature to me says that when something's easier to do, we tend to do it more often and better, right? So things like patching, right? Like antivirus definition distribution. So it becomes easier to manage our environments. And when we manage our environments inherently become more secure as well. So again, I know we're kind of jumping between some of those different things that we siloed out, but all of these things are interconnected, right? The logistical problems go hand in hand with the security problems, because if folks are taking that laptop and we're shipping it out to Colombia and they're pulling data down on it locally and that laptop goes missing, like you said, very problematic depending on what the nature of that data is. And sure, you have to worry about the liability of personal information, but especially in like the healthcare field as well. Now, even if no one ever acts on that data, does that constitute a breach? Do you have to report that? Are there fines that are levied onto your organization? Does it become increasingly more challenging to get cybersecurity insurance going forward too, which is a whole other financial consideration that goes into this as well?
I got to add some color to this, because as I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about this, and I'm looking at everybody's background. So I live in Philadelphia. My office is in Philadelphia. Today I am working from home. I see Kevin's background, he's working from home. I see Max's background, he's working from home. So you got four guys with a lot of tenure. We're all working from home. The last time I checked, most of the people in my IT department, they work from home too. And that further add an element of complexity to this, when those 350 machines show up in King of Prussia or show up at my IT's employee's apartment building on a pallet, right? Like, I think we're all forgetting the fact that we still need to do 3 to 4 hours of work on a factory PC before it's even ready to be sent to an employee to use. Again, last time I checked with Kevin, the average time, you're not doing a lot, but the average time to provision a brand new PC is probably 3 to 4 hours. Of course, what do we love about virtual desktop? I can provision 300 virtual desktops in 10 minutes.
Yeah. And your example is not an exaggeration of, let's ship 300 devices and our IT person lives in an apartment okay, we're going to have a pallet delivered because it has to be, like this is, I feel like I feel like DAS gets. I feel like a lot of things in tech, people immediately go to it from a, how do we quantify cost and cost reduction and cost savings? And you say, okay, what's our current IT program, and how does that map up against going into a DAS platform? And by the way, you guys offer different versions and flavors of remote desktop, so we should talk about that too. But when you line those up, you say, oh, I'm going to Best Buy and I'm buying a PC for $300, and it's that's it, and I run this PC for 20 years, right? But that's not really the mentality of what you're solving with DAS. This isn't like, hey, we're going to find you a cheaper way to run a PC versus going to Best Buy and buying it. I mean, you're talking about real business problems of how do you manage users at scale? How do you provide logistics at scale? How do you solve compliance issues at scale? How do you solve cross-border data domain issues at scale? This is, how do you manage an efficient IT operation at scale? I started in IT. I think the ratios were 65 to 1, so 65 employees to one IT person. And last stat I saw was like 165 to 1, and I'm sure that stat's going up. And so it's I think the mentality around DAOs has to shift a little bit in terms of like, this isn't competing with buying a $300 PC. And also, when I saw this the first time, again, 1998, we were talking about MTBF on devices, right? So a PC maybe had a usable life of 2 to 3 years, just with technology advancement and manufacturing quality. But the thin devices at that point had a 30-year MTBF estimate. I mean, there was no fan, there was no moving parts, there was no hard drive, there was nothing. I mean, one of them had a demo where they would come to your office and like literally put the thing in a bowl of water and take it out with a hairdryer and then plug it in. And I mean, really impressive. But, we get into this conversation also around like, what does the device look like? Well, what device do I use? What device? And it's, in many cases, it's the device you already have, right? Like, I mean, how... if somebody's onboarding into your platform and is going to use Evolve IP, you don't see very many like 1,000-person, like we just materialized out of thin air with 1,000 employees, right? Like there is a legacy and a lineage of that IT program. What does that conversion look like, and then what does that onboarding really entail, and then how does that evolve as time passes, right? Like there's like today's state, tomorrow's state, next year's state, and how does that change?
I want Kevin to talk about that. I just got to jump onto a previous comment because it's one seller and two engineers. So, and I say that, with much love. I can tell you that in the beginning days of selling selling DAS, in 2012, 13, 14, 15, we would invariably get after 18 months at X amount of dollars per month, I could go buy a PC. I learned as a seller that if you don't understand the soft cost, don't understand the cost to procure and provision and support and manage and maintain and reclaim and refresh, if you don't get that yourself, I'm walking. I'm out the door. And I guess in the successes that we've had, when a CIO or a CTO says, I want to go virtual, I want to be out of the data center business, they will do everything in their power to prove out those financials. Right? When you start thinking about 500 PCs at 3 hours, per PC, 1,500 man hours, that is a lot of money. So from a financial perspective, is it the cost of the device? It's never the cost of the device. It's the cost of the desk side support that really counts. So I just wanted to get that point out, but let's get to Kevin.
Well,
back with the tech.
also on that thought, Gary, if you've ever been in IT and have to go into a procurement function or your finance function and say, we need to purchase 500 desktops at this dollar amount, that conversation devolves into something else very quickly as well. And a lot of that conversation turns into, what's the depreciation schedule? How do we depreciate this asset? Are we purchasing it? Are we not purchasing it? Are we leasing it? Are we not leasing it? Is it an FMV lease? Is it a dollar cost buyout lease? There is so much conversation around that asset that just deals with how that asset gets booked onto your balance sheet and dealt with on the balance sheet. And I've seen companies, depending on where they are in their life cycle, that don't want to put more stuff on their balance sheet. And that just becomes sure, we know these PCs need to be replaced because 3 years ago we agreed that at 3 years they were going to be replaced, but now we don't want to do it because we don't want this on our balance sheet. So that opens up a completely different discussion where it's like, oh yeah, we had this original aging cycle of at 3 years we're going to refresh our PCs because that's what we're supposed to do. But what happens if we don't? Let's not refresh our PCs for another 2 years. Can we do that? Can we get away with it? And when I was starting in IT, I had a mentor who basically explained, what people experience in terms of your end user experience and impact to culture of sitting down at a desk and turning a computer on, and what enraged your team and what actually made them be able to do their work. But anyways, I think it's never Gary, your point's actually it's perfect, right? Because it's just never an easy decision. It's never just hey, go and buy computers, right? Buy computers from where? What's your competitive bid for computers? Are you going to bid Dell against HP in today's world? Are you building your own stuff? Are you not building your own stuff? Who builds their own stuff? You got to be crazy to build your own stuff, right? But that layer 8 decision and determinations, really, even in the best laid plans, once that comes into play, it changes the equation a lot.
Yeah, and that doesn't, Max, touch on the soft cost side of things at all, right? So especially for organizations that are looking to, operationalize those expenses, right? Move that hardware purchase to that more of an OpEx model than a CapEx model. But you guys both touched on this, and sorry, you got me to the point now that I'm taking notes as we're going because there are so many things I want to circle back to. But you guys touched on this already, right? If you just take the cost of a device and divide it by 36 months, that's going to win every time. Because that's just not paying any attention to the root of the challenges that we're looking to solve, right? So industry averages, and this is probably from a year or two ago, I'm sure they've changed, but with a DAS solution, you're looking at potentially up to a 30% reduction in costs of your administration for your desktop users, right? So that's just all the systems admin, adding users, MACDs, keeping the lights on from an infrastructure perspective. Add to that, you're looking at potential up to 60% reduction of costs around help desk support of those users, right? So just by simplifying the fact that, hey, regardless of who you are in the organization, regardless of where you are, you now access everything the same way, so you're supported the same way, and it simplifies that support process. Also, again, just having that higher manageability helps with that too, because now your users will tend to need less support than they did previously, and the nature of their problems that they do have when they have them are going to change. But that all ties into the device aspect of this, right? So just like we talked about being cyclical in terms of distributed and consolidated computing, I'd argue we're seeing that same kind of cyclical approach within DAS itself, right? Track record on DAS historically was always the client device doesn't matter. It's a dumb terminal that you're just using to get to your resources. Still true, kind of, right? There's a caveat on that now, right? If we're talking about optimization of audio and video in a desktop, that client device starts to matter again, right? It doesn't necessarily matter as much as if you were doing everything locally, but it needs to be a supported operating system. It needs to have at least the resources to run whatever audio and video program you're looking to optimize if it's going to be doing the heavy lifting of that audio and video encoding and decoding. So, yeah, we're still in a position where thin clients are an option, right? Especially thin clients that run things like Windows 10 IoT that have a fully formed operating system that run on them. Zero clients, we see some. We don't see as much as I would have expected that we would have a few years ago, but I feel like that market hasn't really massively taken off. But the biggest piece is exactly what you just said, right? allowing folks to continue to utilize hardware they already have in hand that otherwise depreciated to the point of no longer being relevant in the organization, right? Long, fancy way of saying, hey, we bought this thing 6 years ago. If I were going to go out and buy you a computer now, there's no way I would ever buy you that one, but it still works. So until it stops working, use it to connect to your desktop. And now your client device has cost us $0 for this next budget cycle.
It's so interesting. You think of how many IT departments have stacks and stacks of 4 gig machines that, one, nobody has the heart to throw out because they still power up, but they're just too.
Well, they're also afraid to throw them out because they may have corporate data on them to tie back to our earlier part of the conversation. They might be terrified.
Right. And someone from the EPA is going to come over and find them because of all the so all of those all of a sudden become relevant all over
E-waste
again.
is a problem unto itself. I mean, with these things, and how many IT departments have stacks of computers? I mean, every single one. I mean, have you ever walked into a building and asked to see their IT storage closet, and it's not just a complete disaster of stuff stacked to the ceiling?
You guys don't want me to pan my camera around right now.
No, I mean, it's terrible. Kevin, you talk about like reduction of admin costs and reduction of help desk costs. This isn't like going out and, saying a reduction of admin or help desk costs by saying you're going to lower your head count. It's just when we start talking about these ratios of like how many people, what are they doing, what else they can do. I mean, IT teams are already trying to do too much. There's too much stuff to do. And the whole, like, I can't turn my computer on, I can't print, I can't sign in, like I can't, there's something amazing about. First off, I mean, I'll go back to a thin client for a second. There's something amazing about a thin client device because it doesn't do anything. And if for some reason it breaks, you just replace it with another device, and the device costs you almost nothing anyways, and your troubleshooting cycle just changes. It's like, oh, here's a new box, on the desk. And I think there's also a mistake that gets made, or a misconception, which is a migration to Microsoft 365, to Office 365, and consumption of cloud services. Saying, hey, we're going to be on SharePoint and OneDrive, and of course, hosted Exchange, hosted Outlook now through it. That doesn't alleviate these processes and these costs. Like, you still have help desk, and you still have configuration, and you still have user assistance, and you still have onboarding, and you still have all this stuff that you still have to do. So moving into Microsoft 365 doesn't alleviate this stuff for you. It just changes what your problem area is, right? Like, it's like, this isn't like, there's not like, oh, we flipped the switch and we're on SharePoint now and we don't have to deal with this anymore, right? Like, that's not the case.
Yeah, correct, right? And I've had the luxury of having been on both sides of this equation, right? So prior to working on the cloud side of it, I was an IT director for a consolidated back office for a number of real estate investment firms. And, one of the things that we struggled with was budgetarily, like you said, right? How IT's always been asked to do more with less. And, as Gary mentioned earlier, the state of things right now in the world, IT is being asked to do more with more less, right? Like, budgets probably have never been tighter than they are right now.
More with more less. We're gonna caption that.
Trademark, right? I gotta get that on a T-shirt somewhere. But I'm a huge proponent of, if you're ever talking to a service provider and they start to tell you about how you can reduce your staffing and your headcount, eject from that conversation, because having been on that side of it, it's no one's. To me, it was never anyone else's business when I was dealing with vendors of how I managed my team. You can tell me all the ways that I can augment my team and the ways that I can help them, but what we should all be driving towards isn't reduction of staff. It's how do you better utilize the resources that you have to be seen as more of an asset to the business than a cost center. Because in my experience from the corporate IT side, that was always the struggle, right? IT was always seen as this bottomless pit that organizations just threw money into and never saw a return of. So if we can simplify a lot of the administrative parts of the job, all the keep the lights on stuff that frankly, most of us don't enjoy doing anyway. Now we can free ourselves up to be more of an asset to help with line of business applications and productivity enhancements and developing new processes and workflows. And IT can now start to actually impact the business in a meaningful way as opposed to just being something that a business spends money on.
Max, how we hope this recording will help us? With all of what we're talking about here, we still don't think CIOs wake up in the morning and say, I got to go shop for a DaaS solution. They wake up in the morning pulling their hair out saying, I got a security problem, a logistics problem, a productivity problem. I've got all of these issues that I don't know how to solve, but yet the solution exists.
So it's so funny you say that, Gary. What I do for our clients is translate. It's just it's just that business problem to acronym in the technology stack that solves that business problem, and that's 99% of it. It's just it's impossible to, I have a lot of friends in the military, and it is funny. Of course, you can never rival the military in terms of acronyms, but when you start talking about like cybersecurity, for instance, they're really trying. But, Kevin, you had like 4 pillars. You had like the 4 things, right? Security, mobility, logistics, performance. And Gary, you were just talking about something, and I think there's really like a 5th part to this here, which is, and Kevin, you used the words, like this like bottomless pit or like black hole of budgeting. Traditional IT is a variable cost center and unpredictable, right? And that's a really bad thing when you start talking about if you're trying to model or budget from a finance standpoint, or if you're trying to, on a C-suite level, a senior executive level, forecast and create predictable inputs and outputs for a business. And sometimes, at a certain scale, that's what we start talking about, right? Can we have a predictable input or output? Are we doing a merger and acquisition play? Is this a roll-up play? Do we have predictability in how we do these roll-up plays? I don't know if they're public, so if it's public knowledge, but I won't use their names. But there are PEs that are rolling up companies that are customers of yours, and how much of that is just being able to say, this is what you're going to spend per device or per desktop or per endpoint or per user, and this is just what it is. How much of that conversation are you getting into with companies around, this isn't like we're going to make it cheaper than this $300 PC that you Frankensteined yourself. We're solving these other problems, but hey, guess what? This is your number going forward. And, do you see a lot of that?
Yeah, tons. And honestly, healthcare was the leading edge of that, because I feel like with the way healthcare organizations did their M&A based growth 3-4 years ago, even predictable cost model for per user expenses was massive. They're out there acquiring practices, and I think one of the companies that we dealt with said when they did a new practice acquisition of a clinical healthcare organization, it was taking 4 to 6 months to get them transitioned to their in-house systems. So granted, that doesn't mean that everyone's just sitting there waiting while their keyboards collect dust for 4 to 6 months, but you're certainly not operating at the level of efficiency that you want to. So by having the predictable cost model and by having an easily scalable system that correlates to that, now you can add those users, and if it's 1 user, if it's 5 users, if it's 5,000 users, it really doesn't matter, because now we can break it down to, hey, a DaaS seat costs this from a licensing perspective. You're going to license that person for Office 365 at this version. You're going to add in this security additional features for message filtering, whatever those add-ons may be, and come up with X number of dollars per user for Y users, and that's now your growth trajectory. And again, it's true of adding a single seat or adding an entire practice. It doesn't matter. There's no real variable there.
Yeah, and if you're dealing with an industry that has a relatively predictable application base, right? So like dentists use Dentrix, right? Or if you're in healthcare, you're using this, or if you're a veterinarian, you use what? There's to a certain degree, insurance, right? Like there's only so many primary applications that are inside those places, and if you look at it from like a rinse and repeat in this roll up or now it becomes a really easy selection process. Okay, we're looking for a target that fits this profile and runs one of these 3 applications, and we know we can go acquire them and integrate them in 30 days, right? Like this isn't like that's the other part of it, right? Where you now have predictability of integration, and not just it's not just predictability of cost, it's predictability of integration, and how quickly can you actually affect what you're trying to do from a strategy, right?
Yeah, so if you're a dental,
You said something earlier, Max, that I was just so fascinated by. You talked about the black hole of IT, the unpredictability of IT. In recent years, I'm thinking about how many nervous IT professionals are walking into the boardroom right now in fear that the CFO says, you guys are a cost center, not a profit center. you know, and again, if this was 2021 or 2019 or whatever, maybe it wouldn't make a difference, but this is the year of the recession. So the worst thing the worst curse word in the world now is to be told you're the head of a cost center, not the head of a profit center.
Max, if I may, I'm kind of curious for your perception on this because if you take an outside looking in view, right, I would think that what we all dealt with as an industry through 2020 and into 2021 would have started to change that perception, right? Because every organization out there leaned on their IT team to, turn lead into gold, as it were. So I get now we're heading into some economic downtimes and potentially in or on a looming recession, but why, if that last 2-year stretch didn't help organizations see just how much of an asset their IT team can be, if that didn't happen, how do we make that happen now? Because that to me is like, multiple exclamation points, triple underline, showing the value that IT could bring to an organization.
I can answer for that in two different examples. I'll make two different examples. The first example would be, let's just use internet access. At this point, internet is the fourth utility for every organization, right? Like you have to have network connectivity, internet access in order to function. But when it comes down to it and you look at, okay, well, what internet do we need for a building? Like for the majority of organizations, the actual logo delivering that circuit doesn't matter to them. Like there's no strategic value or difference for most people of saying we have logo A versus logo B versus logo C. It's just who's available. When you decide to purchase a house or move into an office building, very few people are actually looking at that and saying who's the utility provider as strategic value. Now, when we do data center work, absolutely 100% that's part of the equation for us. We want to know who the utility provider is, and given strategically two locations, that utility provider makes a big difference in the actual success of that project and the strategic value of that asset, right? But that's not normal. And at the same time, the other example I would give you would be, this would be traditionally an office space. Is an office space an asset for the company and the business, or is it just something that you have to have so you have a cubicle for people to go work out of? And some companies use their office space as an asset for the business to develop and maintain culture for the company, or as a recruiting, and retention strategy, or as a client acquisition play, right? And they really invest in their facilities, and a lot don't. So IT fits into that same thing where it's not, for most people, most companies don't view IT as it's a cost center. It's like we have to have this thing because, we have to have a computer and we have to have email, but we don't really value this thing as an enabler. Now, and again, that comes down to, this is a culture issue that starts, I think, top down, right? It's going to be very hard if you were hired in as an IT practitioner in one of those organizations to really change the culture going bottom up. You can change the conversation and you can start pushing people in that direction, but it is a big hill to climb. But yeah, I mean, have you ever heard? Let me back up a second. American Airlines is touting their technology for their reservation systems and how sophisticated they are and how they can keep track of their crews. Before Southwest had a complete and total meltdown of their 30-year-old scheduling platform that completely crippled their operations for a week, would American have ever been out there being like, we have the best technology, look how great our business runs, and we can manage planes and crews? I mean, that was an American story, but now it's a competitive differentiator for them because their competitor had such an issue. And it's, I feel like it's like that, when you say it's like from an outsider looking in, it's partly outsider, true, and partly insider just, going through this for so long, technology is a big differentiator between companies. Like you can move faster, you can do things faster, you can be more efficient, you can generate more leverage. We talk about like, hiring people in Colombia, and I don't want to make this like a wage issue, but the cost of US labor versus Colombian labor is different. The cost of Indonesian labor is different. And when you're competitive on a global basis, if you're not taking advantage of global resources, right? And like these are all things that technology gives you the ability to do, right? But anyways, hopefully that kind of gives you some sense. So we like I get asked like how much internet should we have? Well, you should buy as much as you can afford, and that's what you should run. Like what's your budget? Should every office have 10 gig? Yes, absolutely. I want 10 gig in my house. I need it. I want it. I can't afford it. I don't have it. But, like I have a gig E-circuit instead. But I'm one of the weird ones that shopped in neighborhoods based on who had, real GPON-based fiber to the home. So that way I could get phenomenally fast fiber optic internet service. But how many people buy a house based on that selection? Nobody. Like that would have never been on my wife's selection criteria.
Yeah, on the grid, I think means a little bit different to folks like you and I than it does to other people where it's like, yes, water and power, we're good.
There's more awareness to it, right? If you had to go work from home in 2020 and you had horrible internet at your house, you were very aware of it. And I had clients that, executives at companies that were, that had horrible experiences, and they knew exactly what times of the day they could not work because virtual schooling was going on and the neighborhood was just being crushed with kids on, video conference with their schools, doing schooling from home. And again, senior executives running large companies that shifted their working hours to the point where they were working like vampires because it was the only time they could be on the internet, and we solve those problems for them in different ways. But
it is amazing, just to shift a second here. It is amazing when you think about the change in, tastes. Our days are consumed with going from a Teams meeting to a Zoom meeting to a Teams chat to a one-on-one WebEx meeting, whatever the case may be. And of course, these days now, if I'm not looking at you, something must be wrong. You're probably not dressed. And when I think about this, and I think about, that what was the global PBX market is turned on its head because of the pandemic, right? And how that, and I'm not sure it's the pandemic that's going to cause this meteoric rise in the use of virtual desktop, but I do think it's the economy that's going to do that. And I think it's going to take people like you, Max, to be telling clients, you know what the problems are, but yet you haven't reached the conclusion on what the solution is.
Let's talk about this, right? You talk about like the four things you solve. I think you solve five things, okay, right? So the four core things that you solve. And there was a comment of, no CIO wakes up in the morning and goes, oh, I need to deploy a DAS solution to solve my problems, right? So what are the entry points? We've talked about a few examples, but like let's talk about this really. Like what is a CIO trying to solve? What is a CEO trying to solve? What is a board trying to solve that creates this, like, we have to go find a solution and hopefully they, figure it out and plug the pieces in, or have somebody that they're working with that can tell them, like, here's how you solve this problem. But, what are the trigger points that people, I don't want to say the whole, like, what keeps you up at night, kind of question, but,
Well, I think it's funny. You already said the first one, the client of yours that was told, cut your costs by 50%. And that's a big trigger. Once they start realizing how much of their cost from a time perspective is doing things they've hated doing for the last 20 years anyway. No one wants to help Mary Lou launch Excel, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of them, right? The problem is we know in the industry that DAS is a great hammer. How do you get everyone to see the problems that they have for nails, right? So that's always the struggle, and a lot of it are things we already touched on, right? Security, business continuity, compliance, the auditability of an organization, right? Having that higher degree of security and control. I mean, the other big one in the last 2 years has been workforce hybridization, and frankly, people are probably tired of hearing about it because I know we're getting tired of talking about it. So I can only imagine it's exponentially worse being on the receiving end. But even for organizations that have every intention of bringing 100% of their workforce back in house, and I hate to think about this, right? Because I don't want to manifest this into the world, but what happens if 2 months from now you decided you're bringing everyone back, everyone's back working in the office, things are humming along, and we find ourselves right back where we were in March of 2020, right? You have to then send everyone home. So even those organizations that don't think that they need this still need a contingency in the back of their head of what happens if we go down this same path again and we have to fully hybridize our workforce or fully mobilize our workforce. So, that's a big one. The security piece is always a huge one, and compliance goes hand in hand with that based on whatever industry you're in and the regulatory bodies and the alphabet soup that govern it, right? If you're healthcare, high trust, HIPAA, if you're, financial services, FINRA, FFIEC, SEC, you name it, GDPR, we already talked about for international organizations. Like, how do we leverage things that when you attempt to deal with at the board level or the CIO level, you're not going to necessarily associate of, hey, I solve my compliance issue with a client computing solution. Hey, I solve my business continuity problem with a client computing solution. So drawing those lines of, understanding that DAS is more than just client computing. It's client computing in a way that allows us to sustain being remote, that allows us to sustain continuity of operations in the face of adversity. And then obviously the cost piece is all that Gary mentioned, kind of sprinkled into that with the reduction of effort around supporting an environment.
Kevin and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, and I sure hope I can communicate this the way we were talking about it. Yeah. In our industry, everybody's always been talking about the impending event. The impending event. People are not searching for security solutions after they've been breached. Of course, by the same token, so many of the security companies are selling FEAR, right? There's only two types of companies, those that have been breached and those that haven't been breached yet. We find it very difficult to want to talk about things like that. We also know that if we talk to a client that is in the midst of making a huge PC procurement, and all of a sudden wants to check the box and get a quote for desktop as a service, it is really just to justify the decision that they've already made. So it's just that we think that there has to be a change in the thought process with, that it can't be based on the impending event. I am opening up a new location that will have 300 people, and I need to supply them with something. Or same token, I love the security elements of DAS. Right now, I'm locked out. Can you get it installed on Monday? Kevin, is that a fair statement? I'm going to go to you real quick because I know we sort of talked about that if we start talking about desktop as a service from the perspective of the impending event, we may already be too late.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? Like you said, if an organization is scrambling in the wake of a problem, then it's not so much a conversation around the business challenges that you can address and really looking to stem the loss of blood from that particular wound, right? So that's always a challenge, and you're not going to walk into an organization that just had a network security breach as a result of a laptop or desktop that was out there in the world that got compromised, and get them to seriously commit the time spent around the table to talk about, well, we can put in this desktop solution that has a lot of components to it and a lot of conversation that has to go around it, right? That's like telling folks like, I'm going to help you avoid getting hurt instead of putting a bandage on where you're hurt now. So yeah, it definitely should be more proactive than reactionary. But even in organizations like that, there's still an opportunity for us to talk about ways that this solution can help them. They're probably just going to be looking to pull the trigger on something that's a bit more point in time reactionary to the specific nature of the problem that they had.
And it's funny, the last component on that is I am sure the wounds are still wide open on the immediate panic that set in March 2020 when everybody said, get out and don't come back. That my guess is that most IT professionals want to try to avoid what they had to do during the pandemic, which adds yet another element of, having this be a much more proactive conversation.
It's so relevant to what you asked earlier in terms of like the relationship between IT and companies. And I have a client who had done a Teams voice deployment. I mean, in January of 20, I think is when it went live. December of 19, January of 20. I mean, something right there. It was fresh enough that there was organizational resistance coming back of like, well, what do where's my physical phone? And I don't have my speed dial button anymore to call, to call my wife's cell phone or what, just anytime you forklift a major piece of technology, like what comes out of it on the other side. And then shutdown orders came in and everybody was forced into a work from home. And within 2 weeks, the conversation had completely shifted where, just by happenstance and by timing and luck, the IT team had deployed, something that became massively business enabling for the company, and they were ready to go. And it was just timing. I mean, you talk about like preparing for the event. I mean, I spent 20 years in Southern California talking about the 10.0 earthquake that we have to prepare for. And it took me, I feel like, a decade to actually understand that most companies just wanted to talk about it. They didn't actually want to do anything to really prepare for it. Let's see, what do you want to go to next? You want to talk about like deployment and integration and administration, or do you want to talk about, should we talk about flavors of DaaS first? What do you think is a better place to start? Let's talk about flavors of DaaS. And I think this is also surprising for people because when you talk about, this thing that is desktop as a service, now you're really talking about hosted application delivery. You're talking about session hosts and, shared desktops. Not shared desktops isn't the right word terminology, but I'll use that crudely. You're talking about VDI, virtual desktops. You're talking about, so how does a company that's looking at this make sense of, because the technology is new in the first place, the concept is new, and then you start talking about the options become complex and there's a depth of them. How do you walk somebody through that decision process and help them figure out like, this line of business and this user base is here, and this line of business and this user base is here, and is it all for or nothing, or is it individualized?
So I've got some thoughts on that, but Max, and because you know the audience of people that I sell to, which is the indirect channel, that these are not people that traditionally have sophisticated IT backgrounds. I always start with, you're all good consumers. And there was a day when you went into Best Buy and there was 10 machines all lined up. They looked identical, right? They all had a clamshell design with a keyboard and a screen. And you started looking, and there was one that was $399 and one that was $2,599. So as a good consumer, you started to look not at what it looked like, but what the little card was that was underneath it. And you still then began to realize that it all comes down to 4 components: CPU, RAM, disk, operating system. There's the cheap ones, and then there's the ones that are, so that's my first place, is to make sure that people understand that when they are buying a PC, they are not buying the keyboard and the screen and the clamshell. They're buying CPU, RAM, disk, and the operating system. So when they begin to think of flavors of virtual desktop, think of it in terms of CPU, RAM, disk, and the operating system. And I think people leverage that. They get it. They They can understand that because that's what I'm going to deliver to you over the internet on the device of your choice. So now becomes the element of, well, do you want this hosted privately in my data center? Or, Mr. Microsoft, do you want this installed in Azure? And of course, Kevin had pointed out there are reasons why you would want to install it in Azure, right? And especially if you've got an office in London where they have a GDPR requirement that data cannot leave London, we don't want that traffic to hairpin back to the United States. It has to stay built in a public cloud data center that's housed right there in the UK.
And this is important, so I want to dig into this a little bit. Evolve has its own infrastructure. You have your own data centers. You have your own servers and your own storage and your own platforms that your clients can connect to and run on top of. And Microsoft has come out with Azure Virtual Desktop. And of course, Azure, they want to push everybody into Azure because go figure, it makes them a lot of money. And this isn't an either or for you. This can be a and. This could be a one or the other. I mean, it's, companies that, after talking to you, decide, okay, it makes sense for us to have these users connect to Azure in this region, right? Because they're wherever they are. This is something that you still help them with. This isn't we can't talk to you anymore because you decided to be on Azure.
Correct, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, if you don't mind. So the one thing that I would want to put out up front, right? When we talk about virtual desktop in Azure, the natural connection that people make is Azure Virtual Desktop, right? At this point in time, we actually do not sell Azure Virtual Desktop, right? We take the same DaaS solutions that we offer out of our private cloud environment and offer those solutions in Azure, just with Azure as the underlying data center provider. There's a very specific reason, Max, that we do that, and that is what we talked about earlier, right, with RDP and the protocol being nearly as old as I am. So with Microsoft's Azure Virtual Desktop solution, when that first really started to come onto the scene, one of the limitations around it was that it was still primarily using the RDP protocol for remote access to those desktops. So where that left users is, a lot of the same challenges that we historically associate with VDI of, the fall down of audio and video and media-rich applications, that stuff was still prevalent in those solutions because of the protocol limitations. Now, in their defense, Microsoft has worked to address that and change that, but we have a very good track record with the VMware Horizon and Citrix solutions that we leverage that specifically enable us to offer the best user experience that we can with optimizing that audio and video capability in their DaaS platform. And at the end of the day, anytime we're talking about any form of client computing, the most important aspect of that is the user experience. Because if users can get into the platform and work in a secure fashion, but they're not working in a way that's conducive to how they want to work, it doesn't matter how good the solution is, they're never going to adopt it.
How active are companies, or, are your customers on an average in saying, this should be on VMware Horizon or Citrix, right? Like, is this something that even gets exposed to them, or just something that you go through, a questionnaire and sizing and technology and stack, and it just ends up being like, okay, this belongs here and this belongs here, and it's just completely transparent to the customer?
It's a little bit of both, right? I'd say the vast majority of our customers come to us and say, hey, I need to be able to get to the grocery store, to church, and to the office, and they don't really care how they get there. And then we get some folks that come in specifically and say, I'm a Ford guy, I want to buy a Ford. I'm a Chevy guy, I want to buy a Chevy, right? So it's those same kind of battle lines that are drawn there with brand loyalty to one solution versus the other. Each solution has its merits, right? Each has some things that it does a little bit better than the other. The vast majority of our customers at this point in time are on VMware Horizon and Horizon Cloud on Azure for our desktop solution. But we do have some customers for whom DaaS via Citrix is the better fit, whether that means they want to do some stuff with published applications, whether they're layering in some additional like app protection features or something that ascribes to more one solution than the other. But for us, we're really agnostic in that process, right? We want to work with the customer to go through a pretty detailed discovery process that will allow us to offer our suggestion for what we think the best fit is. But if that customer comes to us and says, hey, we want to do it this way versus that way, okay, no problem from our perspective. We're happy to construct it in either design.
It's interesting, Max. I would add to that when we talked about the predictability from the cost perspective, especially as it pertains to private equity roll-ups, once companies have determined that they have two flavors of desktop, right? They have they have this group of employees that uses 6 gigs of RAM and 16 and 2 CPU and so much storage, and then they want them to have this level of licensing with this voice package that's tied to their instance of Microsoft Teams. Then they have, for $122.14 per employee, that is an incredibly predictable cost model.
The other surprise that I think comes out of this is, at some point there was a standard that was made. And Gary, you touched on this for a second, right? Like an organization IT decides, okay, we need to have this CPU and 16 gig of RAM and this hard drive, and this becomes our fleet. But when you move that off of physical hardware and you go into a virtualized based platform, which ultimately, what we're talking about here, the resource consumption changes. You don't necessarily need to have 16 gig of RAM per desktop. You don't need to have a 10-core CPU. You don't need to have a terabyte of hard drive for each user. So the efficiency actually can change. And also, if they're still doing rich voice and video, and we're talking about leveraging a desktop, in either reclaiming the existing fleet. I have this right now with a organization. They have 4 gig. They have laptops with 4 gig, right? But you're still going to push, voice and video processing down to the device. So that's also coming off the platform. So how do you walk through that sizing exercise of saying, I know you've got this much CPU and this much RAM and this much hard drive now, but you don't need it anymore. I mean, is this just they have to deploy it and see it and then you resize their environment for them? Or, is this something that comes out up front?
Yeah, some of it is just pretty evident just through the conversation of understanding what the application load looks like, right, and what the use case is for those users. Some of it's done through testing. So we have demo environments that we can spin a seat up into to let them see that performance firsthand. With our private cloud-based solution, we can really limit the options to 3 different designs, right? There's a 6 gig of RAM, an 8 gig of RAM, and a 16 gig of RAM seat. CPU is consistent throughout. So 8 gig of RAM is going to be the minimum for anyone looking to do any form of unified communications or collaboration in their seat. So now the options come down to 2. The great thing about public cloud is the world is your oyster, right? You have so many possible permutations and combinations of resources. The hard thing about public cloud is you have so many possible options and permutations of resources, right? That's the challenge. Literally the list goes from this long if you're doing a private cloud to this long if you're doing it in the public cloud for how many different seat types are available to you. So some of it's
analysis paralysis too.
Yeah. And like you said, right, every client is over provisioned if you're still in a traditional compute environment where you're going out and buying hardware resources, right? To be a bit of a nerd and apply the same car analogy to it, right? Why does every consumer vehicle have a speedometer that goes up to 170 plus miles an hour if we're not allowed to drive it over 65?
Because it looks cool is the answer to that question.
Exactly.
Who wants to drive
So it's the same thing when you're going out and buying a laptop that has 16 gigs of RAM and an i7 multi-core processor that you're only running Chrome and Word on. It's overkill a lot of times because it's easier to provision things that have more than you need than less, and you can charge more.
The question that I have back to you two engineers is, I think the obvious question is, if they have 16 gig machines, do they really need 16 gigs once everything's virtualized? Probably not. Conversely, how many people have bought undersized machines that all of a sudden are trying to figure out if they can get 4 more gigs of RAM on their machine, which of course in the virtual world is a toggle.
Yeah, I was gonna say I would add to that too, of not even just how many folks bought undersized machines, but resource and applications requirements change over time. So if your company just went through a procurement cycle a year ago, and now all of a sudden you guys introduced a new financial modeling application that needs more than what you bought a year ago, are you going to go through and now expedite your next hardware purchase 2 years early? Probably not. But in a virtual environment, it's easy to just increase those resources on a user by user basis for only the people who need it. And it can be done immediately.
Quick side story, Max. One of the major CCAS, contact center providers, recently just endorsed Evolve IP's DAS solution to work on their platform. And Kevin and I both worked on that. As you know, and initially when the conversation started, it was, yeah, we think we can run your client in the virtual desktop, but the voice must run locally. And of course, we were like, well, that is not necessary. So right away, of course, the engineers from this rather large contact center company were like, oh, no, we can't run the voice through the desktop. And we're like, well, you can, and we're going to prove it to you because it's critically important from a compliance perspective that the voice does run through the desktop and does not run locally. Now, the way I translate that is every application, whether it's QuickBooks or it's some high graphic audio video, every time you install an application on your machine, they all have the same requirements. It needs so much CPU, so much RAM, so much disk. So while, of course, we want to test everything, as long as we understand that we have the resources, we can run the application.
Let's talk about administration, and what the actual, let's talk about the nerd stuff, right? This is the stuff that we get into of like, how does this actually work? And what I mean by how does this actually work, like what is the process for a company that's onboarding with you to like figure out, create, deploy desktops? And then who is responsible for maintaining them? Who changes them? We talk about help desk function a little bit. Gary touched on this earlier. Where do the lines like what is Evolve doing? What is the company's IT department doing? How do you work together? Who's responsible for what? And what does this life cycle look like?
The cop-out answer, right? The quick knee-jerk reaction answer is it's variable per customer, right? Because we offer a full spectrum that you can kind of fall anywhere on there in terms of managed services. If you want us to be the platform provider and you bring your own tools, your own licensing, your own management, fantastic. We're more than happy to do that. You want us to provide our remote monitoring and management and antivirus tools into your environment and you manage it? Also perfect. No problem for us. We're happy to do that. You want us to provide our own tools and do the management of those tools for you from an RMM and an AV perspective and do your Windows patching? We can do that too. So really there's a little bit of a sliding scale there. The only caveat that we have on all of that is if you expect us to do the management, and this would really be true of any provider, we have to leverage our own tools in order to do it, right? So you can't say like, hey, I have this antivirus application that I know and love, that I've always known and loved, that I want to continue to utilize. I'm going to toss you guys the keys. If you want your provider to manage it, the provider really has to use the applications that their teams are adequately trained on. But yeah, the good news is the administration side of desktop as a service is pretty straightforward. I say this all the time when we're doing demos of the environment, and I'd say 50-50 people roll their eyes, but DAS to me, if we take the technology out of the equation, DAS is a relationship, right? All DAS boils down to is all the spinning gears and levers that allow us to associate an operating system and the applications that we have with the users that we want to deliver it to. Everything that happens in the middle is just enabling that relationship. So if we look at it that way, all administration comes down to is managing our underlying templates, associating those templates with resources, and then assigning those resources to users. So the only times that a customer or their IT team, whatever will even have to go into the DAS admin portal, is if they want to make changes to their images, right? If they want to provision a new operating system or push new applications, or if they want to update their underlying templates to have the latest revisions of their antivirus definitions or their Windows updates. If you structure the way you build that relationship in DAS well enough, you can do things like leveraging Active Directory security groups for all of your user provisioning. So now, presumably, the same way you do all of your permissioning for everything else in your organization, like file shares and access to servers, you can now just simply add or remove users from groups to provision desktops to them. So if I had an accounting group and I have an IT group, and for whatever reason, Joe in accounting moves into the IT department, we simply remove him from one group and put him into the other, and the next time Joe logs into the platform, he's now presented with the appropriate desktop that is mapped to that security group. So the user administration side of things is really easy. The other piece that I do want to really point out is, from a platform support perspective, we're there 24/7, 365, right? Anything that is an issue at the platform level as far as the infrastructure to support the DAS solution, that is 100% on us, as an escalation point or a first responder. The piece that we do not specifically do in Evolve IP is we are not end-user facing help desk in these environments. And frankly, if I'm the customer, I wouldn't want us to be, right? Because we're never going to know your line of business applications as well as yourself, your team, the vendors with whom you already work on those things, right? Like, we're not going to be QuickBooks experts, to Gary's point earlier. They can tell you how to go in there and close out your yearly books for last year. We don't want Gary answering the phone to tell someone how to do a mail merge in Excel. I don't think that would be in anyone's interest.
And this goes back to the whole, like, this isn't this isn't a job displacement transition. I mean, your help desk is still your help desk. Just what they're doing, you eradicate stuff that they shouldn't probably be doing anymore, right?
Like, yep. IT augmentation, not replacement.
That is the ultimate misnomer that typically happens at the supervisor level. We don't replace IT people. We just get better utilization out of them.
So let's talk about the our favorite 10-letter word, ransomware. And the horror story for an organization usually unfolds something along the lines of somebody got an email and clicked the link and it did something horrible to the computer, and then it replicated itself throughout the organization and it sat dormant for some period of time. And then people came and turned on their computers one morning and they get a wonderful blue screen that says, pay us if you want your data back. And now they say, pay us if you want your data back and you don't want us to release your data, right? So now DAS as a technology doesn't, you can still, things still happen on desktops, right? Like, there's still desktops, but the cycle of this changes somewhat. So how, companies that have, I don't want to say like had the experience of ransomware and are looking for preventative measures to keep that from happening again, but like what talk me through this and let's talk about ransomware and DAS and how this shifts and what this means.
Yeah, so the most obvious one, right? The easiest line to draw is that if we limit remote access into our environment, right, that every single external user who's connecting back to internal resources, their machine is not becoming an extension of our internal environment. By default, we've now halved the amount of potential threat vectors that we have into the organization, because now all of those devices are just, again, dumb terminals. So if my personal machine here that's sitting on my desk gets compromised, it's my concern, but it's not Evolve IP's concern, because that's not going to be able to propagate ransomware into Evolve's environment. As you said, though, Max, right? A desktop is a desktop, like we talked about earlier. So is there potential for the DAS seat itself to get compromised? Absolutely. Just like there's potential for any desktop to get compromised. But the thing that we have to remember is, since it is easier now to manage our desktops because we have all of those desktops in one place with a single management structure over them, it's now easier for us to apply patches to them. It's easier for us to update our antivirus definitions in a proactive manner. It's easier for us to have network security components that are constantly evaluating that entire client computing environment, to make sure that there isn't a breach or there isn't an issue, and if there is an issue, that issue doesn't easily and quickly propagate across the network. So again, to me, it's just that human nature thing of we made the job of securing the environment easier, so by default, the environment should be more secure as long as we're doing the job.
In the worst case scenario, and I've seen this, where you turn around and you say we have 1,000 PCs infected with this thing that we have to go out and touch and clean and reinstall by hand. I mean, there were hospitals, and the imagery of these hospitals were the National Guard on site in these hospitals doing the reinstallation and helping the hospital chain trying to come back online. Terrifying to think about, actually. In your platform, you're not spending that time touching every computer by hand. You're deleting and recreating virtual instances at scale. And, you know, how long does that take? I mean, if you had 1,000 desktops that you said we wanted to delete every single one of these things and just recreate them, how long does that take a company to do?
Yeah, I mean, navigate to where your desktops are, isolate the ones that you want to change or get rid of, select them, right-click, delete. Next time a user logs in, the DAS platform is going to see how many licenses you have allocated for that specific image type. They log in, new image is provisioned to them, and they're off and running. So, I mean, that work that would have taken a massive effort of calling in the National Guard and probably realistically days, right, to go through and reformat or reprovision physical hardware on site, now you're down to minutes. I mean, depending on the size of the organization, maybe say hours just to add a little buffer in there for, you know, a vast number of seats to repropagate all at the same time, but certainly a significant decrease in the level of effort required.
But this isn't IT touches every seat. This is IT. You're talking about deleting the affected desktops and letting users re-log in and the platform do what it needs to do automatically by itself without additional user intervention. So in theory, if you had 1,000 desktops, you decided to do this, one person could delete 1,000 desktops, and that would be the extent of what they had to do in order to have this happen.
Let's just make sure, just for clarity purposes, that one administrator can do all this without having to leave their desk. Nobody's going to visit anybody. So I did want to. I've got to kind of get to the end of the time on this one.
Well, I mean, we're right there anyways, Gary. I was going to actually offer you the second to last thoughts. I'm going to let Kevin go first.
Yeah.
If you can't tell by now, Max, I would literally talk about this all day. I mean, I do talk about this all day, but I would talk about it with you guys all day in this venue if I could. But no, really, you know, appreciate the opportunity for us to get on here and talk the technology and tell our story. And to me, like we said it multiple times, right? But it boils down to the biggest challenge is we know that this is an amazing tool. We know that this is a force multiplier for IT departments everywhere. We know that this can solve so many different business challenges that organizations deal with on a daily basis. It's just the challenge of how do we help folks out there understand what those challenges are that this solves for. Because I can conceivably say you can come to me with virtually any IT problem, and I can tell you a myriad of ways that DAS can help you solve that problem. So we need to get out of that fundamental thinking of desktop as a service as being a client computing solution and think of it more as being an IT Swiss Army knife, right? Like it can help us do so many of the different things that we need to do on a daily basis. We just have to start seeing it that way, right? We fall into this trap of like, yes, DAS is a remote access solution. And it is, but it's so many other things too.
And then for the question of what does it look like, it looks like exactly what you're using right now.
Correct. Yep. Underwhelming by design.
Underwhelming by design. Another T-shirt. more less underwhelming by design. There you go.
It's more or less underwhelming by design. There we go. We can simplify that message.
You know, we've talked. We've gone around the horn with this, right? But I mean, you've been selling, supporting, deploying, maintaining, involved with DAS now for companies that have transitioned into this platform. Understand what they're getting. And I mean, I can't imagine they would. It's one of those things that when you make this change, you can't imagine life before that change. So, what would you say to somebody that's stumbling across this for the first time and thinking about this and kind of wondering about could we do this? Does this work? Would this make sense? Like the usual question chain, right? Like, is this appropriate? Is this really going to help us at all? Like, why should we change or, not do what we're doing today anymore? The simple answer, of course, is like, no, it just works. You should just do it, of course. But, what would you actually say to them, and how do you help them through that, journey?
It's interesting. There was a time not too many years ago where if I didn't have a PBX with phones and paging systems, I would have lost my mind. Right? And of course, in the last decade, nobody buys a phone system anymore. Then of course it's this whole concept of if I don't have my servers in the closet behind me, I will lose control of the business. I'd say AWS and Google Cloud, Azure would have a thing or two to say about that. I think the last of the late great things that you just got to give up on is having control of that desktop environment. So I think the thing that I would say is that invariably you're going to do it. Just like invariably I needed my my 85-year-old mother to give up her Motorola flip phone and get an iPhone. Okay? So you're gonna get there at some point anyway. I think again, it's just a matter of Nike had it right. Just do it.
It's an inevitability, but the faster you get there, the more you can take advantage of it and leverage it, and excel and reap the benefits of it. So
you had a story earlier that I absolutely loved. And I'll leave you with one. We have a client that implemented virtual desktop in, I think, October of 2019, because they were required to do a full pandemic test. Imagine this, right? So they deployed it, did the pandemic test, sent everybody home, and then all of a sudden, it was no longer a test. So there's an IT professional right now that is being hoisted up for he's a jolly good fellow, and there's a lot of other CIOs and CTOs and CFOs and CMOs and CISOs that are out there that will get the same accolades for making the move now.
What incredible timing. Gary, Kevin, it's been a pleasure. Always a pleasure talking to you, Gary. Appreciate these very much.